It's hard to pin down a clear definition of the Reti opening, but it's mostly about setting up a double fianchetto, pawns on d3 and c4, and a queen and bishop battery on the long a1 aj diagonal. The classical Reti typically includes pawns on d5, c6, e6, light square bishop on f5 or g4, dark square bishop on e7 or d6, and the knights on f6 and d7. It's like the London system, only for black. Now in this video we are going to deal with the black's bishops sitting on f5 and d6, taken from a true classic, Reti versus Lasker, played in New York about 100 years ago. It's also a great chance to see how Reti himself played the Reti opening. We had knight f3, c4, b3, g3, bishop g2, bishop b2, white castled, followed by d3, and knight bd2. Now, take a look at black's dark square bishop. It's nothing that unusual to see it on d6, but most often it's placed on e7, which raises the question, what's the real difference between these two? It doesn't pose any direct threat to white's king, but it stops white from controlling the e5 and paves the way for a possible pawn push. A good idea is to think about the drawbacks. For example, if white gets the pawn to e4, there's a chance for a fork on e5. Plus, if black takes and white recaptures, the bishop becomes exposed. For instance, after rook e8, e4, d takes c, d takes c, knight takes c4 loses a piece on the spot. So white is thinking about e4 the moment bishop d6 is played. The only concern is that since c4 is already on the board, after e4 the d4 square becomes a hole. In another video, I mentioned delaying c4 to keep things flexible. That way you have the option to advance the e-pawn and enter the king's in attack instead of committing to c4 and the Reti opening. It all comes down to where black's dark square bishop goes. In the other video, it was on e7, so he didn't control e5 or threaten to push the pawn there. That let white stick to the usual Reti setup. But in this game, Reti already has c4, and Lasker's bishop is on d6. Now, should white go for the e4 plan anyway? Or stick with the usual strategy of creating the queen-bishop battery, ignoring that the bishop isn't on e7? Tough to say. In the game, Lasker pushed e5 without delay. Reti took on d5 and played rook c1, aiming for the queen-bishop battery. Now, without trading pawns first, black could respond with d4, locking down both bishops. After the trade, if d4 happens, the g2 bishop becomes one of the strongest pieces on the board. Trading pawns on d5 also strongly affects white's e4 push. If e4 is played without the pawn trade, white ends up with a weak square in the center. But when c takes d5 is included, after e4 black takes and white recaptures. Now black cannot take the pawn because they lose a piece, so the bishop retreats to e6, and after queen e2, white has a weak square on d4 as before, but black also has one on d5. Just notice that without trading c4 for c6, the d5 square wouldn't turn into an outpost for white. But as we know, instead of e4, Reti opted for rook c1, and after queen e7, rook c2. Interestingly, even with the queen on e7, e4 worked perfectly fine for white. Because after the trade and taking the pawn, white plays knight h4, winning a piece. And if bishop takes c4, knight takes c4 and knight recaptures, white has the same knight's move, threatening on e4, while knight f5 is in the air, winning the bishop. You can clearly see how the bishop on d6 ends up misplaced. Also, it's worth pointing out that white does not always need to waste a move, like queen e1 or rook e1, to prepare e4. Tactical tricks can often speed up the plan. Back to the game, Lasker played a5, preparing an annoying a4 if the white queen completes the battery. For that reason, Reti responded with a4, stopping black's plan, with a price of weakening b4 square and b3 pawn. Lasker pushed h6. The idea seems to be that if the bishop needs to stay on the b1 h7 diagonal, it can retreat to h7. Then if it's needed on e6 to hit the weak pawn on b3, white won't be able to harass it with knight g5. Here, Reti stubbornly continues with queen a1, even though the engine is practically screaming now and the move before that e4 should have been played. Lasker simply added another defender with rook f8, aiming to neutralize the battery. A riskier option would have been d4, and after knight h4, playing bishop e6. This would leave the b7 pawn hanging, but with a huge compensation to follow. White went with the automatic move rook fc1, but the engine actually prefers a different idea. It's about the weakness on b5. The knight retreats to b1, heads to c3, and eventually lands on the outpost. Now, rook fc1 was met by bishop h7, a move that might confuse you at first, since it doesn't do much or anything really. But it's actually about anticipating future pawn breaks, like e4, where knight h4 or knight d4 would hit the f5 bishop and gain a tempo. It's also a solid prophylactic move against white c4 as well. White went for the weird move knight f1, even though the knight could have gone to the b5 outpost instead. The idea was to shuffle the knights around so they wouldn't get hit by the e4 push, while also trying to get the bishop on g2 active. Well, Reti clearly had a thing for his bishops and their control of the central diagonals. But moving the knight weakened the b3 pawn. Lasker quickly took advantage of that with knight c5. Now, if white sticks to the plan, that same knight could jump to a6 and head for b4, which would be a nightmare for Reti, as his rook would be forced to block his beloved diagonal. So instead of defending, Reti decided to seize the initiative with a brilliant positional sacrifice. A rook takes c5. 1 point down, but the long diagonal is open again, and there's an isolated pawn, could become a target. The g2 bishop is much stronger, and black's pieces are all without coordination. Lasker chose rook ac8. Now, all of white's pieces are active except for the f1 knight. So Reti goes with knight e3. It's a tough move to play because it can weaken his pawn structure. But black's only strong piece is that bishop on c5, and if it gets traded off on e3, there will be no strong black pieces left on the board. Lasker went for queen e6, defending the pawn. And then computer suggests yet another exchange sacrifice on c5, something I wouldn't even consider. This time white does not even get a pawn in return. But with such an overwhelming piece activity, the compensation becomes more and more evident the more you look at it. Reti thought it might be a bit too much and played a calm move h3. Prevents black's potential idea to get rid of the two knights, starting with the bishop takes one on e3. After f takes c, knight g4, because after trading there, the g7 would be defended by the queen. And here, black made a mistake with bishop d6. After exchanging the rooks on c8, white gets a chance to completely take over the game. Pause the video and see if you can find what Reti missed in this position. Correct move is knight 5 to g4, and it shows how powerful this Reti battery may become. In this case, both bishops are getting involved, and actually all white's pieces are taking some part in the combination. The knight on f6 defends d5, and indirectly g7 pawn. Now it is being threatened, and if it takes on g4, there is an in-between move bishop takes d5, followed by h takes g4, winning a pawn in the process and keeping the initiative with all these pieces in the center. Now this combination really highlights the power of the Reti system and what happens when black lets the queen-bishop battery starts doing its thing. But Reti decided to go for knight f3, tempting Lasker to grab the pawn, since the knight on e3 is hanging. Both of these biggies saw that bishop takes f6, g takes f, knight g4 is terrible for black, and it definitely looks scary. But the engine suggests bishop b8, followed by king g7 and f6, telling us that black actually has things under control. Of course, a human mind does not work like that, and instead of bishop takes g3, Lasker decided to defend the knight on f6. We had knight d4, then queen d7, and king h2. Can you guess what Reti's idea was behind this move? His goal was to set up another queen-bishop battery. Reti's obsession with diagonals and batteries is really something else. Black played h5. Reti followed up by setting up the other battery with queen h1. Here is where Lasker started playing like a machine. If white grabs the pawn with knight takes d5, then after h takes g, f takes g, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop f6, the bishop gets shut down while the knight is pinned. The game could have continued with queen f3 and rook d8 to disrupt the new battery by provoking e4. Even so, white's pieces stay active and centralized, keeping things balanced. Instead, Reti miscalculated by taking the b7 pawn, thinking that his knight on d4 is safe, because the c8 rook is under attack. But the real trouble starts when the rook moves. How to defend the knight? The only way is e3, which drops the d3 pawn, leaving white with two weak pawns and an exposed king. Lasker went for rook c5, doing the same thing, stopping bishop d5. Now in case of e3, bishop takes d4, bishop recaptures, black is completely dominant after rook c2 check and bishop takes d3. Now Reti tried one last trick, bishop a6, trying to catch black on the back rank with bishop takes, white recaptures, queen takes, and queen a8 mate. But of course Lasker saw it. He calmly made room for his king, leaving white stuck with same problems. Now, e3 loses the same way as before, thanks to bishop takes d4 and rook c2. White tried queen b7, hoping to exchange queens and ease the pressure on d4. Black stepped back with queen d8, and then came b4, trying to add another defender to the knight in case of a takes b and queen takes b4. And here Lasker found a forcing line to reach a winning endgame. Rook c7, queen b6, rook d7, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, and now e3 is forced, leaving the b4 pawn to be taken. And suddenly this passed pawn becomes a real menace. After king g2, Lasker played another fantastic move, bishop takes d4. If white takes with the bishop, there is always a threat of rook takes the bishop on d4 and promoting the pawn. Pushing the pawn immediately doesn't work because of bishop c4, where white creates a strong blockade. So Lasker needs a quick prep move, like bishop f5 or f6, to get the bishop onto g8, a2 diagonal. When that happens, sacrificing on d4 becomes huge. For example, bishop f5, a5, b3, bishop c4, bishop e6, setting up rook takes d4, clearing the way for the b pawn to promote. Simple and effective. So Reti was forced to double his pawns, leading to an agonizing, completely lost endgame. After bishop f5, white tried bishop b7, hoping the a-pawn would maybe create some complications. But once again, Lasker chose the simple solution. I really like it, bishop b6. The idea behind this move is to meet a5 with bishop d5, clearing the clouds and leaving white with no active pieces to work with. After king f3, black went with the bishop b3 first, trying to provoke the pawn to move before bishop d5 is played. There isn't that much of a difference between those two. But in the game we had bishop c6, which allowed Lasker to activate his rook along the 6th rank. At this point, it doesn't really matter where white's king goes. The game ended after king f4, rook e2, bishop c1, rook c2, bishop e3, bishop d5, securing the b-pawn promotion. Even though Reti lost the game, it clearly demonstrates his approach to the system with both bishops fianchetted, the pawn on c4, and the battery along the a1-aj diagonal. Of course, this works only if black isn't too aggressive in controlling the center and keeps their pawns on d5, c6 and e6. In other cases, I strongly recommend adding the King's Indian attack to your repertoire, aiming for the e4 pawn advance.